When we think about medieval travel, our imagination tends to betray us. We picture knights in shining armor galloping through green fields, pilgrims striding purposefully toward distant cathedrals, or merchants sailing across sparkling blue seas with treasure chests full of spices. It all feels like a grand adventure, the beginning of a quest straight out of a fantasy novel. But the truth is much less romantic. Medieval travel was slow, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. Journeys that today take us a few hours by car could drag on 4 days, even weeks. Roads were muddy, carriages bounced like wooden boxes on wheels, and if you didn't end up robbed by bandits, you might still arrive with lice, fleas, and shoes worn through to the bone. So why do we love the image of the wandering knight or the brave pilgrim, when the reality was closer to a survival show? That's exactly what we'll explore in this series. Imagine this: you're a peasant in 13th century France. Your cousin in the next village is getting married. The distance, maybe 20 kilometers. Today, you'd cover it in less than half an hour by car. Back then, you'd set out at dawn on foot, carrying a hunk of bread and maybe a flask of weak ale. By the time you arrive, it's late afternoon, your feet are raw, and you smell like every farm you passed on the way. And if it rained, congratulations, you've spent the day wading through mud that tried very hard to eat your shoes. Travel was not just uncomfortable, it was risky. Beyond bad weather, there were thieves lurking on forest paths, toll collectors at bridges demanding their fee, and the constant threat of illness. Even something as simple as drinking the wrong water could turn your trip into your last. And yet, people did travel, far more often than we might think. Pilgrims set out for holy sites, merchants carried goods across kingdoms, nobles visited courts, and armies marched on crusades. Human curiosity and necessity pushed people onto the road, no matter how dirty and dangerous it was. This series is about stripping away the romantic gloss and showing medieval travel as it really was. Not the stuff of fairy tales, but the daily grind of moving from point A to point B in a world without asphalt, GPS, or reliable plumbing. If modern travel blogs talk about finding yourself on the road in the Middle Ages, you were more likely to lose yourself, your purse, your health, or your life. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a grim lecture. We'll laugh a little along the way, because medieval travel had its absurdities. Think of it as a mix between a history documentary and a road trip gone very, very wrong. So tighten your belt, grab your walking stick, and forget everything you thought you knew about knights in shining armor racing across Europe. The reality was more mud, more blisters, and a lot less glamour. Welcome to the dirty truth of medieval travel. If you've ever complained about potholes in modern streets, congratulations. You would have absolutely hated medieval roads, because in most of Europe, the simple truth is this: there weren't many proper roads at all. The Roman Empire had built a network of magnificent stone highways that once stretched from Britain to the Middle East. They were paved, well engineered, and built to last. And indeed, some of them did last. Bits and pieces were still in use in the Middle Ages. But after Rome collapsed in the 5th century, few people bothered to maintain them. Stone roads slowly cracked, weeds pushed through, and whole stretches simply vanished under mud and forest growth. By the 12th century, most of what people called a road was little more than a beaten track through the countryside. Picture this: not a smooth lane, but a dirt path churned into ruts by wagon wheels and livestock hooves. In dry weather, it was dusty. In wet weather, and Europe had plenty of that, it turned into a swampy trench that swallowed her wheels, shoes, and sometimes entire carts. And then there were the bridges. Some were sturdy stone constructions, built in Roman times or sponsored later by wealthy monasteries. Others were little more than wooden planks that creaked suspiciously as carts rolled across. Many were owned by local lords who charged travelers a toll just for the privilege of not drowning while crossing a river. Travelers in the Middle Ages had to plan around these conditions. A merchant caravan could only move as fast as the roads allowed, which meant maybe 20 to 30 kilometers on a good day. And that's if nothing broke down. Horses stumbled in the mud, wagon axles snapped in deep ruts, and entire journeys stalled until repairs were made. Urban areas weren't much better. City streets were rarely paved before the later Middle Ages, and even when they were, they doubled as open sewers. Imagine maneuvering through narrow lanes filled with market stalls, chamber pot waste tossed from windows, and the occasional wandering pig. You weren't just traveling, you were playing a medieval obstacle course. And we can't forget the geography. Mountains, forests, and rivers sliced through Europe like natural barricades. The Alps, for example, were formidable year-round, but winter crossings were nearly suicidal. Pilgrims bound for Rome or Santiago de Compostela sometimes froze in high passes or slipped into ravines. Entire groups vanished in storms, leaving only grim stories for those who came after. So when people talk about the road to Canterbury or the way to Santiago, don't picture a straight, inviting highway. Think instead of a patchwork of muddy tracks, uneven cobblestones, and treacherous passes, each stretch owned by a different lord, abbey, or town, each demanding fees or favors for safe passage. That was the medieval reality of roads, unreliable, dangerous, and exhausting. It made every journey a gamble. And yet, somehow, people kept moving. Pilgrims trudged on, merchants braved the mud, and soldiers marched through it all, one blister at a time. If roads were bad, the experience of traveling on them without a horse was even worse. And let's be honest, most medieval people traveled on foot. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, so for peasants, pilgrims, and the majority of townsfolk, walking was not a choice. It was the only option. Imagine setting off at dawn, carrying everything you own in a sack slung over your shoulder. Your shoes, if you had any, were likely made of simple leather, thin and easily worn through. Barefoot travelers were common, because shoes cost money and often wore out before they could be replaced. Your daily rations were modest, a chunk of bread, maybe some cheese, and water drawn from streams, which might be contaminated with, let's just say, not the healthiest bacteria. Distance was measured in hours, not miles. A healthy, well-fed person might manage 20-25 kilometers a day on good terrain. But good terrain was a fantasy. Mud, rocks, uneven paths, and steep hills slowed progress. If it rained, the journey became a slog through ankle-deep or worse mud, and rivers could rise suddenly, forcing travelers to detour miles out of their way. And danger was everywhere. Forests provided shelter and shade, but also harbored thieves and wild animals. Wolves were a real threat in many parts of Europe, especially in the winter months. Bandits, though rarer than legends suggest, could easily ambush a lone walker or a small group, especially on isolated roads. Even a seemingly safe path could have toll gates run by local lords who demanded fees in coin or goods. Refusal could lead to a fight or imprisonment. Traveling on foot was also physically punishing. Blisters, sprained ankles, sore knees, sunburn, and exhaustion were standard fare. Those who survived the journey did so because their bodies adapted to hardship from a young age. Medieval adults were not delicate, they were hardened by labor. Yet even they could be humbled by a week of trudging through rain-soaked countryside. Then there were the social and sanitary challenges. Roads were shared with animals. Cows, pigs, and donkeys roamed freely, leaving behind a not-so-subtle warning to watch your step. Open defecation along paths was common, meaning travelers navigated a literal minefield of waste. Thirsty walkers often drank from the same streams contaminated by animals, an unwelcome bonus of the adventure. Pilgrims, however, accepted these hardships as part of a spiritual journey. People traveling to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome endured conditions that modern tourists would call horrific. Pilgrimage guides advised taking sturdy shoes, carrying salt for purification, and praying constantly, not just for spiritual enlightenment, but for survival. Many did not make it all the way, succumbing to exhaustion, illness, or accidents along the road. Despite these dangers, walking was sometimes the fastest option. Carriages were slow, roads were treacherous for wagons, and horses were expensive. The pedestrian traveler could navigate narrow paths, cross rivers at fords, and adjust speed to conditions, advantages a cart could not offer. Walking also allowed for social interaction. Traders, peasants, and pilgrims often traveled together, sharing food, advice, and warnings about dangerous stretches ahead. So the next time you think about a medieval journey, forget the cinematic image of knights galloping heroically across golden fields. For most people, medieval travel was about putting one foot in front of the other, hour after hour, with aching muscles, mud-soaked shoes, and a constant prayer that you would survive the night. It was endurance, not adventure, hardship, not glamour. Yet somehow, they did it. And some even came back to tell the tale. When we think of medieval travel, the image that pops into most people's minds is a knight in shining armor, charging across the countryside on a powerful steed. Hollywood has done a fantastic job cementing this mental picture. Galloping horses, banners flapping in the wind, heroic music swelling in the background. Reality, however, was a little less cinematic and a lot more practical. First of all, horses were expensive, not just to buy, but to feed and maintain. A decent riding horse cost a small fortune, and even nobility had to budget carefully for fodder, stabling, and farriers. Most ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, and even many merchants, simply could not afford horses. When they traveled, they did so on foot, as we discussed in the last chapter, or occasionally by borrowing a mount if a kind relative or patron offered one. Even among the wealthy, not all horses were created equal. There were light riding horses for speed and agility, heavier destriers for war, and small pack horses for carrying goods. The destrier, the so-called war horse, was bred for battle, not comfort. Riding one across miles of uneven terrain was exhausting for both horse and rider. Nobles often preferred a more manageable riding horse, the palfrey, which was smaller, calmer, and much better suited to long journeys. Distance and speed are another place where myth clashes with reality. The cinematic gallop across rolling hills, rare. A horse can gallop at speed for only a few kilometers before it needs rest. Most medieval travelers who rode a horse spent the majority of the day at a slow trot or walk, covering perhaps 30 to 40 kilometers per day on a good road. And as we established, good roads were few and far between. Mud, ruts, rocks, and rivers slowed progress considerably. So, the fast travel of a mounted knight was often only marginally faster than walking, especially for long-distance journeys. Horseback travel also carried its own risks. Roads could be treacherous, horses could stumble, break a leg, or throw their rider into a muddy ditch. Bandits and highwaymen were more interested in mounted travelers because they had money, but also easier to catch if you were alone on a road. Pilgrims and merchants traveling with horses often formed small groups for safety, making travel slightly less dangerous but more cumbersome. Horses also required a surprising amount of preparation for a journey. Riders had to carry feed for their mounts, water for themselves and the animals, and sometimes spare horseshoes if they expected rocky terrain. Travelers crossing mountains or long rivers had to plan their route carefully. A horse cannot swim across a river, and steep slopes or swampy marshes could be fatal for a mounted traveler. Interestingly, horseback travel also had social and symbolic importance. Nobles rode horses not just for speed, but to display wealth and status. In many cases, the way a person rode, the quality of their saddle and tack, and even the color and breed of their horse sent clear messages about their rank and wealth. A mounted knight arriving at a town was as much a spectacle as a practical mode of transportation. Yet, despite the glamour, horse travel was not universally easier or more comfortable than walking. Exhaustion, mud, weather, and terrain were as punishing on a horse as they were on a human body. And while a knight on a destrier might cut a heroic figure in a battle scene, the reality of long-distance travel often looked more like trudging with a stubborn mule through a rainy field than any romantic gallop across a sunlit valley. If walking was misery and horseback travel was expensive and exhausting, what about wheels? Surely rolling along in a cart or carriage must have been a huge improvement, right? Well, sometimes, but not in the way you might imagine. Medieval carts and carriages were not exactly the comfort vehicles of today, and calling them fast would be generous. Most carts were simple, two-wheeled affairs, often made from rough-hewn wood with iron rims. They creaked, groaned, and wobbled at the slightest bump. Axles weren't lubricated with oil, not that they would have had much, so friction meant wheels often stuck or broke under heavy loads. A single pothole or deep rut could snap a wheel, topple the cargo, and leave the driver swearing in several languages, none of which would be polite. Then there were wagons. Four-wheeled wagons could carry heavier loads, like sacks of grain or barrels of ale, but they were slower and even more cumbersome. On muddy or rocky roads, a loaded wagon might cover just a few kilometers in a full day. Roads weren't just bumpy, they were obstacles in themselves. Travelers often had to stop and repair wheels, patch broken axles, or manually push a stuck cart out of mud. The idea of a leisurely countryside ride, forget it. Medieval road trips were labor-intensive, whether you were walking or rolling. For the wealthy, carriages existed, though they were rare before the late Middle Ages. These were four-wheeled, enclosed vehicles, sometimes adorned with cloth or leather covers. They offered more protection from the elements. But comfort was relative, seats were hard, suspensions were basically non-existent, and a bumpy road meant hours of jostling. Anyone expecting the smooth glide of a modern coach would be sorely disappointed. The only real advantage was status. Riding in a carriage announced wealth and privilege, and sometimes even political power. Speaking of status, carts and carriages were also heavily regulated. Local lords often imposed tolls, fees, and restrictions on who could use certain roads with large vehicles. Bridges might be too narrow or rickety for a loaded wagon. And forget about night travel. Most journeys happened during daylight because carts couldn't navigate dangerous terrain in the dark without falling into ditches or colliding with other travelers. Merchants relied heavily on carts for trade. A well-organized merchant caravan might include multiple wagons, pack animals, and guards. The pace was slow, but it allowed larger quantities of goods to reach markets safely. Traveling alone with a cart was risky. Bandits loved to attack slow-moving vehicles, especially if they carried valuable cargo like spices, cloth, or coin. A group could defend themselves, but organizing such protection added time and expense. Water transport, which we'll discuss in a later chapter, was often preferable for bulky goods, but carts were essential for short-haul overland transport. Even today, archaeologists can see the ruts left by medieval carts in stone and dirt roads, silent evidence of countless journeys, some miserable, some necessary, all slow. Interestingly, carts and wagons were sometimes more democratic than horses. Anyone with enough skill to handle a wheel, and some animals could attempt a journey. However, democratic in the medieval sense did not mean comfortable. The same muddy roads, broken bridges, and unpredictable weather that challenged horse riders also challenged cart drivers, often with worse results. And let's not forget hygiene. Carts and wagons often shared the road with animals, waste, and mud. Long trips meant sleeping in the vehicle or under a tarp, sharing space with livestock or cargo, and dealing with fleas, lice, and the occasional rat. Comfort, once again, was not part of the medieval travel package. So what's the takeaway? Rolling wheels made some journeys possible, but speed, comfort, and convenience were rarely achieved. Medieval carts and carriages were functional tools, symbols of status, and sometimes lifelines for trade, but they were also noisy, slow, and prone to disaster. A road trip in the Middle Ages was not about sightseeing, it was about survival, patience, and a strong stomach for bouncing over rocks, mud, and every imaginable obstacle. If land travel was slow, uncomfortable, and full of mud, water travel might seem like a dream come true. And, in many ways, it was. Rivers, lakes, and seas functioned as the medieval highways, offering a relatively smoother, faster, and sometimes safer way to move people and goods. But dream is relative. Life on medieval watercraft had its own hazards, and it was rarely glamorous. Rivers were the arteries of trade. Major European rivers like the Rhine, the Danube, and the Seine connected towns, cities, and ports, allowing merchants to move heavy goods much more efficiently than overland. A barge or a small riverboat could carry as much cargo in one trip as several carts on the road, and without the constant threat of mud swallowing wheels or horses stumbling. For merchants, rivers were a lifeline. The types of vessels varied widely. Simple flat-bottomed boats navigated shallow rivers, sometimes propelled by poles or paddles. Larger cargo ships and barges, often equipped with sails, could move even more goods with fewer people. On the coasts and open seas, ships ranged from small fishing boats to substantial merchant vessels capable of transcontinental trade. Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League cities built entire economies around maritime transport. But water travel was far from risk-free. Rivers could be unpredictable, with sudden floods, hidden rocks, and treacherous currents. Flat-bottomed boats were stable in calm water, but prone to capsizing in storms. On the open sea, travelers faced waves, sudden squalls, pirates, and navigation challenges. Compass and maps were limited. Sailors often relied on landmarks, stars, and experience, a combination that could be fatal if luck ran out. Life aboard was cramped, wet, and smelly. Cargo often shared space with passengers, and sanitation was rudimentary at best. Seasickness was a constant companion, and a single storm could turn a routine journey into a nightmare. Sleeping arrangements were uncomfortable. Meals were meager and prone to spoilage, and privacy was non-existent. Unlike on land, there was no easy place to rest your legs, stretch, or take a quick detour for relief. Despite the discomfort, water travel offered advantages that land simply could not. Distances were covered faster, and the physical toll on the traveler was lower, at least in theory. A day's journey on a river could exceed what a person, or even a horse-drawn cart, could manage on roads. Merchants could transport bulk goods like grain, timber, or salt, which would have been almost impossible overland. Pilgrims could reach sacred sites more efficiently, and armies could move troops along rivers to strategic positions. Security, however, remained a concern. Pirates and privateers were a real threat in the coastal and riverine world. Even a well-armed merchant ship could be vulnerable if it encountered hostile raiders. Cities and kingdoms established watchtowers, patrols, and tolls along key waterways, making navigation a mix of strategy, luck, and diplomacy. Traveling alone was ill-advised, and many preferred to join convoys for protection. The social aspect of water travel was unique. Ships and barges were microcosms of society. Captains made decisions, merchants negotiated cargo space, sailors competed for duties, and passengers endured close quarters together. Cooperation was essential, and disagreements could escalate into mutiny or sabotage. But it also allowed for cultural exchange. Travelers shared news, ideas, and goods, knitting together distant regions in ways that road travel alone rarely could. In terms of speed, comfort, and efficiency, waterways were the closest thing the Middle Ages had to modern highways, but they demanded skill, resilience, and nerves of steel. A calm river day could feel almost luxurious compared to trudging through muddy roads, but a storm at sea reminded travelers that nature held all the power. So, while rivers, lakes, and seas offered a path forward, they were not magic carpets. Life on the water involved its own hardships, wet clothes, cramped quarters, uncertain navigation, and the ever-present threat of drowning or attack. Yet for those who could master it, water travel opened doors that land could not, connecting communities, enabling trade, and allowing medieval Europe to move slowly, dangerously, but remarkably effectively. After a long day on muddy roads, rocky paths, or riverboats that tossed you like a rag doll, medieval travelers faced one of their greatest challenges, finding somewhere to sleep. And here is the spoiler: it usually wasn't pleasant. Welcome to the world of inns, taverns, and monasteries, where comfort was relative, beds were optional, and personal hygiene was, let's just say, aspirational. In towns and cities, inns and taverns were the go-to option for most travelers. These establishments ranged from humble roadside huts to larger, more established inns in prosperous towns. They offered food, drink, and a bed, if you were lucky. Beds were often simple wooden frames with straw mattresses that smelled faintly of mildew, previous guests, and possibly a few uninvited insects. And yes, fleas and lice were common companions. Privacy was practically non-existent. Rooms were shared, sometimes with strangers who snored, coughed, or argued late into the night. Walls were thin, and the scent of cooking fires, beer, and unwashed bodies permeated the air. Even the wealthier inns could not escape the basic realities: no central heating, limited sanitation, and windows that didn't keep out cold drafts or wandering vermin. Food was another gamble. Tavern fare was basic: bread, pottage, salted meat, and occasionally cheese. Water was often undrinkable, forcing travelers to rely on weak ale or beer, which, surprisingly, was safer to consume. A hot meal was a rare luxury, especially for those passing through smaller villages. Travelers often had to supplement their rations with what they carried from home: a chunk of bread, a hunk of cheese, or some dried meat. Monasteries offered a slightly different experience. Pilgrims and travelers could sometimes find lodging in abbeys or priories, where monks provided shelter and food as part of their charitable duties. The accommodations were simple, almost austere: wooden bunks or stone floors, basic bedding, and communal sleeping arrangements. Meals were modest, following religious dietary restrictions, but often safer to eat than roadside offerings. In return, travelers were expected to show respect, participate in prayers, or at least maintain silence. Monasteries were quieter, cleaner, and slightly more predictable than inns, but hardly luxurious. Long-distance travelers learned to adjust expectations. A good night's sleep in the Middle Ages meant surviving the night without being robbed, bitten, or frozen. Extra layers of clothing, straw padding, or hanging one's cloak over the bed for insulation were common tactics. People developed routines, scouting rooms for safer spots, checking doors and windows, and keeping personal possessions close. For pilgrims and merchants, the night could be almost as dangerous as the road itself. Rural travelers often faced even harsher conditions. Inns were scarce outside towns, forcing people to rely on barns, sheds, or makeshift shelters. Sleeping in a barn meant sharing space with animals, warmth and company, yes, but also fleas, flies, and the constant aroma of manure. And don't forget the weather. A roof might leak, or a sudden storm could flood the floor, turning the night into a wet, miserable ordeal. Despite the hardships, there was a social aspect to inns and taverns. Travelers swapped stories, shared news, and sometimes formed temporary alliances for safety on the road. A bustling inn could be a crossroads of culture, merchants discussing trade routes, pilgrims sharing tips for holy sites, and soldiers comparing campaigns. It was also a place to gather information, buy supplies, or plan the next stage of a journey, even if you had to endure fleas, noise, and questionable cuisine to do so. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval sleeping arrangements were uncomfortable, unhygienic, and unpredictable, yet they were essential to travel. Inns and taverns offered basic shelter and community. Monasteries offered safety and charity, and both could turn a weary traveler into a slightly healthier, slightly calmer human being by morning. Comfort was rare, privacy almost non-existent, and luxury a dream. But these nightly stops made the grueling days on roads, rivers, or muddy paths survivable, and without them, medieval travel would have been nearly impossible. By now, if you've been following the trail of mud, wheels, and uncomfortable beds, you might think medieval travel is tough, and you'd be right. But there's another layer of peril that often went unnoticed by modern imaginations: the constant, omnipresent dangers of bandits, disease, and bureaucracy. In short, even if you survived the road, you weren't safe from the people, pests, or paperwork along the way. Let's start with the obvious: bandits. Stories of highwaymen may seem romantic in novels and films, but in reality, they were terrifying. Isolated roads, especially at night or through forests, were perfect ambush spots. Even a small group of thieves could easily overpower a lone traveler. Merchants, with their carts full of goods, were prime targets. A cart laden with grain or a chest of coin could turn an otherwise ordinary day into a life-or-death situation. Travelers learned to move in groups whenever possible. Safety in numbers was a literal survival tactic. Bandits were not the only threat. Animals, disease, and environmental hazards claimed far more lives than a lucky mugger. Rivers could flood without warning, storms could strand travelers, and rocky passes could lead to twisted ankles, broken limbs, or worse. Wolves and bears weren't common everywhere, but in many rural regions, they were a constant danger, particularly at night. A traveler might face mud, rain, starvation, and predators all at once, and the odds were rarely in their favor. Then there's disease. Sanitation was primitive, and germs were everywhere, in food, water, bedding, and fellow travelers. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and plague were constant threats. Even a short journey could become fatal if a traveler drank contaminated water or came into contact with someone sick. Hospitals, as we know them today, were rare. Monasteries sometimes offered care, but more often than not, illness meant isolation or death. Traveling wasn't just uncomfortable, it was medically risky. And just when you thought you might survive the natural and human hazards, bureaucracy reared its ugly head. Toll gates, customs duties, and travel permits were common in much of Europe. Each town, city, or lord had its own rules and fees. Crossing a bridge or entering a walled city could require payment, and refusal often resulted in fines, confiscation of goods, or imprisonment. Corrupt officials could make life miserable, sometimes worse than bandits or disease. A small mistake, like failing to declare cargo or lacking the right permit, could cost a week of delay or a large sum of money. Highway dangers also had a psychological impact. Travelers constantly scanned the landscape for threats, assessed which roads were safest, and negotiated deals with local authorities. Every decision, when to leave, which path to take, where to sleep, involved risk assessment. The medieval journey was a series of calculated gambles, with luck playing as much a role as skill. Interestingly, these dangers shaped the culture of travel. Pilgrims developed networks of safe houses and monasteries. Merchants joined caravans, and even armies moved cautiously through hostile territory. Knowledge of terrain, local laws, and social connections was as valuable as stamina or a sturdy pair of shoes. Being streetwise, riverwise, or forest-wise could make the difference between a successful journey and a fatal one. So, while stories of knights facing dragons or duels dominate our imagination, the real threats were far more mundane and far more lethal. Bandits, disease, bad weather, and bureaucratic hurdles made every journey an adventure of endurance rather than heroics. Survival required planning, caution, and a willingness to endure discomfort at every step. By now, we've seen that medieval travel was muddy, slow, uncomfortable, and downright dangerous. But why did people put themselves through all of this misery? The answer lies in the different roles travelers played in the medieval world: pilgrims, crusaders, and merchants, each with their own reasons, challenges, and survival strategies. Let's start with pilgrims. Religious devotion was a powerful motivator in the Middle Ages. Pilgrimages to sacred sites, like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome in Italy, drew thousands each year. People walked hundreds of kilometers, often barefoot, carrying little more than a staff, a pouch of bread, and a prayer. Pilgrimages were physically grueling and socially challenging. Travelers braved bad roads, inclement weather, thieves, and illness, all for spiritual merit, indulgences, or penance. For some, the journey was a path to salvation; for others, a test of endurance. But the common thread was faith, and the camaraderie among fellow pilgrims often made the hardships bearable. Inns and monasteries along the way became lifelines, and shared prayers and meals created temporary communities of strangers bound together by devotion and survival. Next, crusaders. Religious zeal here mixed with politics, power, and adventure. Crusaders traveled to the Holy Land, the Baltic, or Spain, sometimes by land, sometimes by sea. These journeys were not just long but militarized. Crusader armies moved in large groups, requiring careful planning for food, lodging, and security. Roads and rivers were still treacherous, and disease claimed far more lives than battle. Pilgrims and crusaders occasionally traveled together, but soldiers faced unique challenges: heavy armor, the need to transport weapons, and the constant possibility of ambush. Yet for many, the prestige, spiritual rewards, or even prospects of land and wealth made the risk worthwhile. The journey itself became part of the heroic narrative, though reality was far less glamorous than the medieval romances would suggest. Then there were merchants. Trade in the Middle Ages connected regions, countries, and even continents. Merchants traveled by cart, horse, and ship to sell and buy goods, spices, textiles, salt, grain, and more. Unlike pilgrims and crusaders, merchants were motivated by profit. Their journeys were carefully calculated, which route offered safety, which tolls were manageable, and how to protect valuable cargo from bandits or pirates. Merchants often joined caravans or convoys, combining resources for protection and efficiency. Unlike religious travelers, whose success was measured in spiritual merit, a merchant's success was profit, and loss could mean ruin. Merchants had to be shrewd, disciplined, and resilient. The road was a business opportunity wrapped in a gauntlet of physical danger, but there were overlaps. Many travelers combined purposes. A pilgrim might carry goods for trade to fund the journey, or a crusader might engage in commerce, while en route. Communities along well-traveled routes benefited from these overlaps. Inns, taverns, and marketplaces thrived as hubs of human movement, news, and culture. The medieval road was more than dirt and mud. It was a network of social, economic, and spiritual exchange. It's also important to note the demographics. Not everyone could travel. Nobles, clergy, and wealthier merchants had more means to endure hardships. Peasants traveled out of necessity or devotion, often walking long distances with little protection. Women traveled too, though less frequently, facing additional risks. Pilgrimages sometimes included noble women or widows seeking spiritual solace, but the majority of travelers were men. Social status dictated not only the mode of travel, but the level of comfort and risk. In essence, medieval travel was not a single experience, but a spectrum. Pilgrims sought spiritual reward, crusaders combined devotion with politics and power, and merchants pursued profit. All faced mud, disease, and danger, but each group had strategies to cope. Networks of monasteries, inns, and friendly towns facilitated movement, while experience, endurance, and luck determined who survived. The medieval traveler was resilient, adaptable, and remarkably brave, or perhaps desperate. By now, we've traveled thousands of kilometers across mud-soaked roads, treacherous rivers, creaking carts, and crowded inns. We've walked alongside peasants, ridden with nobles, floated with merchants, and braved storms at sea. And yet, despite the hardships, there's one striking truth. The medieval journey is almost always portrayed in history, literature, and popular culture as something far more romantic than it really was. When we imagine medieval travel, we picture knights galloping heroically to save the day, pilgrims singing hymns while strolling through golden fields, and merchants casually crossing kingdoms in style. Movies, novels, and even some textbooks tend to gloss over the reality. The truth: travel was slow, filthy, exhausting, and dangerous. Every mile required effort, planning, and endurance. The romantic imagery of shining armor, sweeping vistas, and carefree wandering exists more in our imagination than on the muddy roads of medieval Europe. But this isn't to say that the Middle Ages lacked adventure or human ingenuity. The very act of moving from one village, city, or kingdom to another demanded courage, strategy, and resilience. People adapted to the world around them. Pedestrians learned how to navigate rivers, forest paths, and highway bandits. Horse riders balanced speed with safety. Merchants devised caravan networks and protection schemes, and pilgrims relied on monasteries, inns, and fellow travelers for survival. Travel itself shaped the medieval experience, influencing trade, culture, religion, and society. Consider the roads themselves. Far from the neatly paved highways of today, medieval routes were treacherous, unpredictable, and often impassable during rainy seasons. Carts and carriages groaned along rutted tracks, horses stumbled over stones, and pedestrians fought their way through mud and animal waste. It wasn't a picturesque stroll, it was a test of endurance. Yet this harshness also created a shared understanding of the land, a network of inns, monasteries, and trading posts, and a culture of adaptation that was both practical and social. The dangers were ever present: bandits, floods, wolves, disease, and bureaucratic tolls could all turn a journey into a nightmare. Pilgrims risked their lives for spiritual fulfillment, merchants risked their fortunes for profit, crusaders risked everything for faith and ambition. And for the common traveler, survival was an achievement in itself. Every step on the road was a gamble, and every successful arrival a triumph. Waterways offered some respite, but brought new challenges. Rivers and seas allowed for faster transport, bulk trade, and connections between distant regions. Yet storms, pirates, and cramped conditions reminded travelers that no route was truly safe or comfortable. Inns and monasteries provided occasional shelter, but comfort was relative, hygiene was minimal, and privacy was non-existent. Night after night, travelers endured blisters, hunger, cold, and the fear of theft or illness. So why does the myth of effortless medieval travel persist? Partly, it's storytelling. Our fascination with heroism, spirituality, and adventure prefers clean narratives. The valiant knight, the devout pilgrim, the daring merchant, the dirt, the exhaustion, the risk, and the bureaucracy are less cinematic, less marketable, and far less appealing than romanticized visions. Yet, understanding the reality enriches our appreciation of these journeys. It's harder, yes, but also more impressive. The courage, ingenuity, and endurance of medieval travelers deserve recognition, precisely because the world was unforgiving. In the end, medieval travel was a crucible of human resilience. Every mile was earned through sweat, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. Roads, rivers, carts, horses, inns, and monasteries were tools and challenges alike. Bandits, disease, and bureaucrats tested the traveler's judgment and nerve. Pilgrims, crusaders, and merchants each navigated this world for their own reasons, shaping the social, economic, and spiritual fabric of medieval Europe. The myth of easy, romantic travel tells us more about our modern imagination than about history, but the dirty, exhausting, dangerous truth of the medieval journey tells us something timeless. Humans have always sought to move, explore, trade, and connect, no matter the obstacles. It's a reminder that adventure is not about comfort or glamour, it's about persistence, courage, and a willingness to face the world as it really is. Muddy roads, creaking carts, crowded inns, and all.